So, hello to everybody, tere kõigile, thank you for coming, thank so many students, seemingly death always sells. So, and I'm really happy to introduce you our today's lecturer, Agita Misāne from Riga Stradiņš University, leading researcher, and yeah, the title you can see already. So please, stay with us. And you told that, maybe say something about the university. You told that this is mostly a medicine university or something like.
Yes. Well, hello everybody from the south. I indeed come from Riga Stradiņš University, which is primarily a medical university. It's a former Institute of Medicine, hence this color. It's supposed to symbolize blood. And on the actual presentation, it looks like blood there. I am, however, not a medical doctor. I represent social sciences there, and I am by education and trade, a religious studies scholar. And I also am a principal investigator of this project, supported by Latvian Research Council. And you see the title of the project. And one may ask, why should we care about death? Well, many people do. And thanatology, as death studies are called as an academic discipline, is in fact quite a blooming field currently, and what we are trying to do was to bring this somewhat underrepresented field here to public attention and to academic attention. I should also say that as a religious studies scholar, I of course know, and I know that you do know, that this has a lot to do with religion. We can even say that if not all, then definitely most religions are about how to get around death one way or another. And religions, of course, offer different solutions to this question. And third, kind of introductory note I have to say is that this is probably rather superficial title. One may ask, is traditional culture something in the past, and should we kind of differentiate between traditional and contemporary culture? We usually do, but for practical purposes, and I'll probably try to show that traditional culture is not dead and tries to influence our lives. In fact, we live it even now, but it affects us in quite unprecedented ways. So let me start with a quote that comes from our corpus of qualitative interviews. So we interviewed this lady, we call her Monta. She's middle-aged, very educated, has a PhD in philosophy. And when her father died some years ago, her family asked her to explain this to her nephew, who was very, very close to his grandpa and was very sort of unhappy and lost. And who is better qualified to explain this than a philosopher, right? So that's why her family asked her. And so she was very confused originally, but then she said, well, what's like when somebody's dead? It's like being asleep but for a very, very long time. And then the boy somehow calmed down, and it was much easier for him to deal with this tragic occurrence. Why I start with this? Well, indeed, who can answer the question, what it is like to be dead? Well, cultures have rather vivid imaginary about what is it like, and what I will try to present to you is Latvian traditional imaginary of what awaits us over there. So basically, we have, in fact, tons of data about all kinds of things, and not just religion. And if you are interested at all, please write to me and we can share them. But I will concentrate today on those two questions, and one is what does religion do with all this? What's the difference, respective on whether you are a religious person or not in the perception of death and dying and afterlife. And second is what are the insights of traditional culture today, and how are they valid? Well, traditional beliefs are, of course, difficult to reconstruct, largely because of the sources at our disposal. But basically, and they all have, each type of source have their own problems. So Latvian folk song corpus is written down largely in the 19th century. The dating is problematic. Apparently, there are some older layers deep down there. Then there are recorded folk beliefs, 4 volumes collected by Peter Schmitz. And then, of course, some that are not printed. Then there are folk tales, and then there are some written historical records that are very limited and also need to be taken with a grain of salt, as they are left by usually Christian travelers or missionaries or monks from various orders, and apparently they are not very objective, and maybe Jesuit reports are kind of the most, at least considered, the most reliable sources, and I will quote some of them. So in brief, if I have to kind of put in a nutshell what's traditional perception of death is like in Latvia, or was like in Latvia, the first thing is that it is a process. It's not like switching off the light or putting out the candle or whatever image we may have. This is a process extended in time, during which slowly a person loses the qualities of being alive and obtains the qualities of being dead. So it starts sometime before so-called physical or somatic death, and it ends, we don't know when, since this kind of disappears in the mist somewhere down the road. And the second important thing is that those who are sort of physically or medically, you can say, dead, are not socially dead. In fact, as I try to show, the dead have rather busy social lives and lots of fun, and some hard work too. And the third thing is that, third point here is that death and the perception of dying is a highly syncretic thing. We see the Christian concepts interchanged with sort of pre-Christian concepts, same phenomena called by Christian kind of term and non-Christian term, and this is how it's kind of been preserved until now. So the one question is linguistical. What do you look at the Latvian language? I don't know if there are anybody in the audience who knows Latvian, but then you have to believe me, simply. So the first word that has been applied to dead person, dead individual, is miruonis, and it apparently comes from the verb mirt, which means to die. So miruonis is the dead person, I'd say that. Another word which is more interesting is nelaitis, and nelaitis, laiks is Latvian word for time. So nelaitis, so that's a denial of time. So nelaitis is somebody who is out of time or beyond time. Maybe time doesn't refer to him or her. That's sort of kind of origin of the word. And the third word, which is very interesting, is velis. And again, if there are any Lithuanians in the audience, then you may have heard of Lithuanian veles or veli. So it's a related concept. So it's difficult to translate. Usually the word is translated either as a shade or as a revenant. So who is velis? Well, most likely, velis is a word used to describe or to name a dead person during this stage when he, is masculine word, may come back, either on specific occasions or during specific times. Sometimes they are called also souls, and if, for example, in the folk in folk songs, maybe in one version it's Velis, and in another word it's Veseli, so this is a syncretism we do see. And corpse, līķis, I've mentioned it here because, well, this is a rather typical thing. That corpse, of course, is a contaminant. You know, there are lots of things you should better not touch a corpse when it's called līķis. Yeah? During the funeral, after the funeral, particularly women should not touch the corpse. If you meet the funeral procession, you need to do certain things, you know, not to get into trouble. The clothes worn by the corpse need to be burned, and so on and so forth. So in itself, there is this kind of ambivalent attitude of the dead person as velis or nelaitis, and then there is, of course, the physical corpse, which you better don't deal with, and if you do, you should know how to. So how one dies. Usually, as far as we can tell, death is preceded by some sort of call. It's either a bird or a sign or a voice or some movement somewhere around. And so the other world calls, one may say. Another thing is looking for the signs, and most typical descriptions would be that the person's nose, let's say the person is ill, and the nose becomes sharp, the chest falls in, so all kinds of physical changes, and then kind of the family around would say, well, this is not going to live, which is very very similar to what people who do care for old people in old people's homes and hospitals, and we interviewed quite a lot of them. Actually, they also say, oh, you always know when somebody is going to die. And in some cases, there are specific rooms where people who look like dying are moved to, of course, causing all kinds of reactions in the surrounding patients' circles, and so on and so forth. So this is apparently having some physical reason to that, and some medical reasons, and our ancestors knew how to read them. And another interesting thing is that in the folk belief, it is common texts that would specify that, in fact, the dead, soon after their deaths, they are kind of aware of what's going on. That the middle one is this dead person can hear what's talked about. Actually, speaking of the senses, it's hearing rather than, let's say, seeing, especially if the eyes are closed. But the dead hear. They are sort of cognizant of what's going on until they are put in the coffin and the cover is closed. So then it kind of stops, that or we don't know. But so the dead hear us. So they are not entirely that dead. So what do they do? The one thing, let's kind of go through the stages. One interesting thing is that veli, let's use this word, they are quite happy to have addition to the crowd. They are waiting for it, they're trying to prepare for this new person coming there. For example, in this song, the first is Latvian and the third comes from Baron's collection and the number. So you see that the mother of Veli, Veļu māte, is quite happy. She's dancing on the grave and she's seeing somebody coming. Another thing is that the dead are supposed to take part in the funeral meal. There are some not very reliable records telling about bringing the actual corpse to the funeral and placing somewhere at the table or in the corner. and only after the funeral meal is done with, then the corpse is being removed. But quite symbolically, and even now, I imagine there's something similar in Estonia too. When, let's say, a Latvian, kind of standard Latvian modern funeral would most likely have a plate with a black candle or maybe some black decoration and sometimes a photo, and sometimes a plain plate is turned over. So the dead person, the deceased person, is symbolically present at the funeral, which I imagine is something we have still kind of playing out of what was there earlier. Another important thing is not to miss the business hours, so to speak, of the other world. They're not, the gates of the other world are not opened all the time. And one may imagine that they are kind of open during the night, because this is all about, the other world, the chthonic world, the dark. No, quite the contrary. Don't be late. Otherwise, you have to spend your night at somewhere hanging around the cemetery and wait until they open again. And the next thing is that veli are not kind of moving very far. They're supposed to stay close, and not just to stay, but also get in the dealings of the family they left behind. So this comes from, as I said, from the Baron's collection, but also we can look at some Jesuits now. Well, one of those who have left quite extensive stories about how those peasants live and behave, and trying to be somewhat sympathetic, but still having his own, of course, face in his mind, is somebody called Peter or Petrus Gulesius. And so he has left this story you can read. So basically what he's saying that there are some interesting things in this text, in my opinion. So he tells about funerals, and then later we'll see what he tells about the veli, feeding of veli, the feast in the autumn. So what about the funeral? So what's important here, apparently those he interviewed or observed, we don't quite understand what that is, took care for the dead not to come back. Quite physically, usually axe is used, waving it around. What he says cuts the air, but it's the movement of waving around, to repel those souls who are apparently over-eager to get, this new company, harassing, maybe calling, doing whatever, to bring this new departed soul into their company. And another thing, of course, is not very surprising that the food is given there, but also tools. So this departed person is not just spending their days idle in the other world, but can work and provide for themselves, which kind of suggests that not everything ready is there. You have to earn your living even after death. As I said, it's good not to be late. And here is another song that describes this, and there's one of the variants. There are quite a lot of them. So basically saying that bury means a morning, because otherwise I would miss the entry in this veli world or the other world, because the veli kids are, is there was a word described to kind of younger and maybe socially lower veli who would do the physical work there, apparently. So they close the door in the afternoon, and then what happens if you miss? Well, you have to hang around in the cemetery. There are songs that say that the departed soul would spend the night at one of the crosses in the cemetery, up there on the cross, somewhere there, and waiting patiently, sleeping maybe, when the door can possibly open. But where that is, what's the geography, shall we say? Well, there's no kind of agreement among Latvian folklorists or scholars of religion where is the other world located, if there is a specific location at all. And we find different kind of suggestions in the sources and also different interpretations. The one thing is, where can a soul go? Well, soul might possibly go to heaven, or in Latvian, heaven and sky is the same word, debesis, so kind of suggesting somewhere up there. There is an interesting place where could they go is Aizsaule, and Saule is a sun, the sun in Latvian, and so it kind of, Aizsaule would be behind the sun. This idea is supported largely, was supported by, for example, Karls Straubergs, the Latvian pre-war folklorist, who had actually quite heated debate with other scholars about how the world of traditional culture of the Latvians is actually constructed. And for example, Ludz Adamovich, who was a church historian but wrote also about mythology, well, he had this very rigid, like three-tier image of, the world, what is above and what is below, and Straubergs would say, well, no, it should be different. And one of the versions is, I tried my best to draw the sphere, but the idea is that we have to look at the path, how the sun passes, and at least how our ancestors imagined what happens to the sun during the day and during the night. So sun would travel during the day kind of in a vertical way over the sphere of the sky and return horizontally through the sea to the starting point to do this again. So it's, I try to draw. And then Aizsaule, the world behind the sun, would be somewhere outside the sphere. Well, suggestion is any other. And the final idea, which I personally like best, is that the dead, the deceased, stay somewhere close where they lived or where they were buried. Again, if we look at the missionary statements and the reports that the same mentioned Jesuits would write to their superiors, they kind of recall some conversations with peasants and for example, saying, well, where do the dead go? And the peasant answers, well, here. Where here? Well, here, showing kind of around, at the farmstead. Also, later in the 18th century and in the 19th century, the Christian church, for example, in Vidzeme, your southern territory, the territory close to Estonia, they had quite a trouble with peasants not willing to bury their dead in the cemetery. They preferred, they tried to bury them early on and bury somewhere close, rather than bringing them further away to the cemetery. And this is what church didn't like, and there was also those hygienic reasons again, and that was quite a fight in some areas. So I would probably myself adhere to this position that they go nowhere, they go somewhere in the shadows, but if we have to locate it somehow physically, the idea it's somewhere close. Now let's look at our friend Peter Kulesius again. In this specific fragment, he describes, it's rather long for PowerPoint, but bear with me. So he writes now about Veli feast. So what happened in the autumn, between late September and late October, the Latvian peasants fed Veli. So this was kind of this one sliver in time when Veli could return and visit the places where they had lived earlier. And they got some food, but also some discipline, I would put it that way. So Clusius writes, that there's a specific way to prepare a table, and also some local elder, he says this is one of those false old priests. Is kind of he is a ritual master. He's taking care of all this process. So he comes and sits in this chair, and older women behind him, and they call out the names of those people who had deceased recently, and they apparently appear. In some other reports, for example, by Paul Einhorn, another priest, he has a different way. He says that during this feast, that the table is laid, and then the people would go out and close the doors, so Veli can eat on their own. And it's actually rather dangerous, to stay with them. And in this text, Clusius kind of suggests that the older people would stay with Veli, and first, before they get the food, they get a lecture, and the priest would then, say, why have you been so bad, and you haven't helped us, and you were so lazy and so inactive, so please do better next year. And after he said it, he says, now it's the time to come to the table, and after a while he says, okay, you've had enough, go. And then he goes on and on, telling, how then the house is being cleaned, and the axe is actually thrown over the threshold, so the Veli do not come back. So again, wrapping it up, it's a long process with certain abilities of the deceased people to come back, so they are not sort of finally dead. It's very difficult to tell if they are ever finally dead. Now we come to our survey. So we conducted a survey as well as some qualitative interview, and we also used secondary data from European value studies. And that is nationally representative, and we designed the survey. It was quite extensive. So what we got? If we look at the religious affiliation, I know pie charts are bad style. Never use pie charts as students, but sometimes they're good to show. We identified kind of 4 groups of people, of Latvian inhabitants, of their kind of religious affiliation. Well, the Christians are the largest group, and Christians were nearly 75%. This is by self-identification, so of course have no way to tell how deep the faith is and what are the practices and so on. But Christians are a big group, somewhat too big, I have to say. Maybe we got something wrong, because generally Latvia, in contrast to Estonia, haven't got a religion question on the census. So we don't get kind of regular data about religious affiliation. We have to rely on all kinds of surveys and questionnaires. And in, say, years after 95, 96, we usually get more or less the same picture. It hasn't changed very much. And the biggest part of Latvian population do not have any religion. Those are about 40%, a bit less. And then the 3 biggest denominations are represented by 20% each. These are Lutherans, Roman Catholics, and Russian Orthodox, including old believers there. So it's like 20, 20, 20, and 40, rather easy math. And some surveys will give a couple of percent more here or there, but it's rather stable. We have a bit different picture. We have a rather big group of Christians. We have a rather big group of atheists. because usually those surveys would show a couple of % of atheists that would fall within statistical error. It's very difficult to say how many are there. Then we have a group called nuns. Maybe, I don't know if you are familiar with this concept, but nuns are it's a sociological term for those who answer the question, what's your religious affiliation, by ticking the box none. So they don't have a religious affiliation. They are not necessarily atheists, but they simply are indifferent. And then we have a group, the orange one, the orange slice on this pie, that we branded inexplicit believers for the lack of better word. So those are these people are who would say, oh, yeah, there is some sort of ultimate reality or spiritual entity. We don't know what that is, but maybe I'm spiritual rather than religious. This sort of crowd we have called inexplicit believers. And I will then look at some of the issues that might be of interest if we look at how religious people would answer, or people with some religious identity would answer. The one question is, let me return to the very beginning of the lecture, and how do you know when somebody dies? And we had a choice. Well, our respondents rather had a choice of three answers. Namely, one is that the person is dead when a sensory loss occurs, and people do not feel anything. That means you're dead. The second question was about when the heart stops. So, the person is dead when the heart stops. And the third choice dealt with functioning of the brain. The person is dead when the brain stops functioning, even as it happens with modern medicine, a person might be supported artificially by all kinds of machines. I wonder what's your answer to that? Think. I wouldn't ask to get hands up, or I did in other audiences. Well, if you look at the Latvian population, well, we go for the heart. This bigger group of bars these are those who chose the answer dealing with the heart, and brain sensory loss is least popular, which is the lower, and then there's brain death somewhere there. And we look at specific phase groups, let's call them phase groups. Then atheists kind of tend to believe that the brain is more important for them. Maybe they are very rational in that respect, while the majority of believers would go for the heart. When we look at specific religious groups, we do see some differences there, but they're not kind of very pronounced. We see that, for example, nuns, again, would be for the sensory loss, and so on and so forth. So in brief, the kind of the leading answer deals with brain, with the heartbeat, and which I suspect comes both from maybe religious sources and also might be influenced by traditional beliefs. It's all about the heart and not about the brain there. Another important question we asked was, what is a good death? Apparently, some ways to go are better than others. And what did our respondents say? By far, painless death is the leader. They could choose several answers, so it's not like zero sum. What is interesting again here that painless death is irrespective of faith, most important thing to achieve, if one can say so, about death. Another interesting thing is that not many people want to have control of what is happening. They would rather, to prefer to die in sleep, for example. However, atheists would like to keep control of what is happening. Hardly anybody wishes to die a heroic death. That would be my answer, actually, on this specific question. We also filled out ourselves now by piloting and kind of so that they don't fit anywhere here. And then pay attention to this lower set of bars. There were people who said there's no good death whatsoever, all death is bad. And who are they? These were people who were mostly young and who hadn't had a meaningful encounter with death that far. We had questions about what was your first meaningful encounter with death, and then what was your most recent meaningful encounter with death. And then there was a bunch of people who said, no, we never had anything like meaningful with death. And those are most likely those who say there is no good death. So what that could suggest is probably that maybe you have to talk about death more. Another interesting thing was that for children, for those who had meaningful encounter with death as children, of course, not surprisingly, then we asked who that was, who died. It was usually grandparent. But in many cases, I think it was close to 10%, it was a pet. It was a dog or a cat or whatever. So that was kind of the most meaningful encounter with death in their childhood. Now, if we look at Christians specifically now, drop the rest and look at Christian, three leading Christian denominations, we see that maybe not that much difference to the general population, but some differences. For example, Orthodox, for whatever reason, do not mind dying in sleep, while Catholics do, and there is statistically significant difference. Lutherans, again, do not that much wish to die at home, but somewhere else. Orthodox is also lead in the choice of sudden death, for example, And Lutherans actually lead in this control of what's happening group. Okay, I have to make a bit step aside here and say that one thing we do know about Lutherans in Latvia is that Lutherans are most alike the secular population. We know this from other studies. Well, principally, we look at the value studies or practices and what they believe. Lutherans are very much like the secular society, and Catholics and Orthodox would be the different. So this doesn't bring any surprise. Further, we'll look at one interesting topic, and that is attitude to organ donation. I don't know how it is in Estonia. I know that in Lithuania is quite similar situation to Latvia. We do really have a problem. There is an option on Portal Latvia LV when you kind of can tick a box that you allow your organs to be used after your death, either for medical transplantation or for science, research and so on and so forth. And when I last checked, I think it was a little bit less than 3,000 people who actually did that. And doctors, transplantologists, keep telling that many people would mention religious reasons why they do not wish for their relatives, if they have sudden death, relatives' organs to be used for transplantation. And they say, well, this is quite a problem. Well, under Latvian law, if it's not specified, technically that means yes, the doctor can use the organ if there's no specific no on this portal data. However, they are supposed to ask the relatives, and relatives quite often reject the idea. And one thing interesting is that in fact there's no religious doctrine that actually forbids organ transplantation, at least with the religions common in Latvia. You can maybe think that the Zoroastrians would mind and Shinto in Japan would mind, but Christians definitely do not have a doctrine forbidding organ transplantation. So one may ask, what religious reasons are these? And in fact, Latvian religious dignitaries have spoken very clearly and have called, to agree to a transplantation of your relatives' organs, saying that, this is the highest sacrifice, and this is the greatest act of love that you could possibly do, and it's a very Christian thing. And apparently it doesn't work. And now the question, what that is then, if it's not a Christian doctrine? And my suggestion, I cannot think of any other explanation, is that this is where traditional culture comes in. Because if somewhere deep down or back in your head, you believe that that your relative is kind of not finally dead, that there's something going on there, then that's probably the reason not to cut them, to give some kidney or lung or heart, or whatever it is, since this is more like cutting live, cutting the live and taking something live, and this is how I think that works really. Now, again, the question what to do about it is entirely different matter. Yes, and even less people would like to donate for science, maybe for their relatives, that's kind of permissible, but not to research. No, suicide, attitude to suicide. Well, suicide is, again, if you look at the Christian doctrine, one of the gravest sins, largely because it is the only sin that cannot be atoned for. When you are taking your life, it's no way to, go to confession and get absolution. This is one of few cases where religious faith groups differ. Atheists and nuns would be kind of more, let's say, less condemning about those who would take their lives. If you look at specific religious groups again, then we see that Lutherans are, again, more like the non-believers, while Catholics and all believers would be kind of, least permissive and more condemning about the suicide victims. Another heated thing in Latvian society is attitude to euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. This is tricky for a number of reasons. One thing is that, I don't know how it is in Estonia, but in Latvian politics, this issue kind of is often on public agenda. When something happens, then it's debated, then everybody forgets for, let's say, a couple of years, and then it comes back. Some time ago, a man called Viesturs Bunja, who was terminally ill with throat cancer, asked for public donations to go to Switzerland, where there is a euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide program. It's quite expensive, and so that's why he kind of appealed to the public. And the money was actually collected, but he died naturally in Latvia before there was a possibility to use the money. And that had all kinds of social consequences. One thing, it again kind of came to the public fora, but also Latvian public initiative page, My Voice, started to collect signatures for the legalization of, well, they said euthanasia, but it was not quite clear whether whether that is euthanasia in the strict word of is the strict sense of the word, or was it what physician-assisted suicide. Anyway, it took a while to collect the signatures, but 2 years ago, yeah, it was April 2 years ago, they collected the necessary 10,000 signatures, and again, under Latvian law, if 10,000 signatures are collected, then Parliament has to react one way or another. So with all those signatures were brought right to the Parliament, and the first kind of sieve is the Application Commission. And what Application Commission did, they rejected the proposal straight away without discussion, and rejected it on the grounds that they have consulted the experts. And who were the experts? There were 2 doctors and 4 priests. That again caused certain all kinds of debates about, what does it mean to listen to religious leaders in a secular country, and should we finally discuss this issue, and so on and so forth. And then it again calmed down, maybe until the next case. But why I'm telling you all this, that another reason why the proposal was rejected without any discussion, in my opinion, the problem is precisely this, that this was not discussed. Might have been discussed, and you come to the decisions that we reject it. Was that Latvian population is not ready for this debate, and even less ready for the legalization itself. And nobody at that moment actually had the data. It's kind of assumptions that Latvian society is not ready. And here we have the data, and we see that they are not that denying, I would say. There is a very big, hard to say block right in the middle, which suggests to me that in fact debate and discussion and information is precisely what we need, so people can decide what are there. But even if we look at and it's also always this talk, that religion doesn't support it, and religious people would never agree on that, and so on and so forth. But if you look at those 3 bars up there, we see that, for example, Lutherans, again, excel as being very, very secular in all this company, and Catholics and Orthodox are less permissive, but not that permissive, I would say. It's in the 40s, in the 40%, which I think is a lot if you say that nobody would. That's another thing we observed. We talked with some priests, and what we discovered was that what individual priests think, in particular those individual priests who work with dying people, is not what the bishops would like them to think. They were considerably more open to the idea of this idea that some, let's say, either assisted suicide could happen in terminal cases after very careful consideration. At least we can talk about it. And in fact, there was even one of the priests who said that had it been legal, I might have chosen the option myself. There comes a moment in every scholar's life when you want to go under the table, when you hear something like that, you know how to handle that. But this is what he said. This is something that we want to bring to the attention to politicians and listen what they say. And finally, let me say something about afterlife. I do not have a chart here, as it was difficult to figure out how to portray it, but I will simply say that there are no significant differences between faith groups when we ask them whether society and human beings would ever achieve immortality. In most cases, they do not believe in that. They do not believe in immortality. And Lutherans do believe less even than Catholics and Orthodox. When we ask, would you like to live forever? Do you want to be immortal? Then some surprisingly little number of people wanted it, which was not exactly a surprise, but something to think about, because isn't immortality and eternity something that a Christian should wish for? Isn't it all about for resurrection, and living together with Christ? I also have a theory here. I don't know how to prove it, but at least I can share it, that this deals with understanding what eternity, let's use that word, actually is. And my feeling is that since most people, and that came out in qualitative part of our study, believe that eternity is a very long time. As Monta said in this, my first quote, it's like being asleep for a very long time, like being alive, immortal for a very long time. This is not exactly what Christianity teaches. If you look at the Christian doctrine of immortality, and it's basically the state where there is no category of time involved. It's a completely different state. You cannot apply, your secular sort of understandings about it. Where did we get this understanding of immortality or eternity as a very long time, rather than something qualitatively different? I believe it was Soviet times. For example, if you look at the obituaries from those times and from now, for example, that's again a question you may share, what Estonians say. What's a euphemism for death? Well, there are several of them, of course, but one typical Latvian euphemism would be that person such and such on such and such date passed into eternity, or aizgāja mūžībā in Latvian. You don't find such phrases in the obituaries from the Soviet times. In fact, I looked through, we have very convenient resource, periodical way, where like all newspaper articles from all times and we are able to access them. And eternity was actually used once during Soviet times in an obituary, so they didn't pass into eternity unless they were high Soviet officials. Well, eternity was something reserved, apparently, for the elites, because there, Lenin's work was eternal, and they are eternal altogether, so on and so forth. And so as I said, my theory, which I yet have to prove, is that this is where we had this idea that eternity is a very long time, because if you don't believe in any eternal life, why should you think that Lenin is eternal? He probably, what you want to say is that he and his work and his deeds would live forever. What about Christians? We offered in our study a set of answers, and I'll tell what we found. What could Christians believe? And Christians generally dominate in this kind of religious interpretation of what happens after death. For example, now taking Christians together, roughly between 30 and 40%, I haven't spelled out all the versions that we have, but let's say between 30 and 40% of Christians interviewed would agree with some of statements like mentioned here, that they believe in heaven after they die, and what you find there is some blessed state, and I believe in afterlife, and I'll meet my family there, those whom I love. It's not that much, actually, if you think at this kind of the upper level being 48 there. No, at the same time, but however, I haven't spelled this out, but atheists and nuns would believe even less in those things. You'll be in not even 10%, it would be like 3 or 5 or 7, of atheists and nuns who would believe in any of these things. However, if you look at other statements dealing with the possibility of being present in your loved ones' lives after your death, we see again that, yes, Christians do believe that, but also nuns and atheists believe in that. For example, apparently 80+% of atheists are prepared to watch over their relatives after they die. And it is not that a small number. And by far, and if you have to kind of choose one interpretation, what does it mean? What does afterlife mean? What happens there? They will say that the dominant answer of all possible choices how one can have afterlife is living in children. There was also an option of living in your life's work and then living in your good deeds and so on and so forth. But those are represented by considerably smaller numbers, so don't spend too much time at work. It doesn't pay off, Better invest in your children. And this 50+% was the highest number of kind of versions of eternity we get. And let me then conclude with kind of some general observations. There were more, but these deal with religion one way or another. One thing that I didn't pay much attention to this, but you have to believe me, that what we found that if you look at Christians altogether and those 3 faith groups, the differences are not that pronounced. However, if you dive deeper into the Christian group, you find that differences between different Christian denominations are in fact more pronounced than one may expect. So Christians altogether are not that different from the other parts of population. However, they're different in between themselves. Now, what would that mean, possibly? There are different. Okay, let me start with the fact that of all 3 Baltic countries, Latvia is the most diverse religion-wise. We are higher on Pew, let's say, religious diversity index. Lithuanians are rather down. They're more religious, but less diverse. And about Estonians, better than I do. But we have those 3 denominations, and then we have all kinds of other faith groups. There's always a question in sociology of religion, what's the consequence of religious diversity? And there are different schools of thoughts and different classics that have responded to that. Kind of one I should say, maybe outdated idea is that the consequence of religious diversity is lower levels of religiosity. Generally, people become less religious when they encounter all these conflicting truths, and then they start questioning. This is, you find this, for example, in Peter Berger's writings before he dropped the idea from the 60s, saying that more or less when you encounter those different truths, then these are like hits towards nomos. Berger has this concept of nomos, the kind of the face overlying the society, and when you have conflicting truths, you don't know what to believe, and this kind of damages this canopy, in his words. Well, another version is that the consequence of diversity is more similarity. That facing and dealing with all kinds of religions, those religions, or rather the practices and beliefs we found with the adherents of these faith groups, they kind of, regress towards the mean. They become more and more similar to each other. And maybe superficial look at Latvian religious environment supports this idea. Both Latvian clergy and your own eyes, in some cases, suggest that Lutherans, Catholics, and Orthodox spend so much time looking at each other that they learn too much from each other. And there's some people would say that some of my friends, priests, would say this is kind of a risk to their religious identity. The Lutherans have their kind of groups that are very much like Orthodox, and very much, some are very much like Catholics, and Catholics and Orthodox also grew more similar over time. And this was my sort of belief, I have to say, for a long time. But then when you look at this, our data from this study, we see that in fact there's pronounced differences between, when it comes to very existential, very important questions between different religious segments of differing by religion in our society. You see that there are in fact differences. So maybe we're all wrong altogether, and then there is some other solution to this question. The second thing we found that, in fact, when it comes to clergy, that opinions of individual clergymen are sometimes rather different from the official church teachings. But we knew that. Whenever you talk to a priest and in a greater detail, and they trust you, and then you get all kinds of things. And the final, last not least, point is that influences of traditional culture, I believe, are very much present in contemporary culture. And when it comes to perception of death, we see that this idea of long time extended dying may have a bunch of consequences, and an organ donation was maybe one of those rather vivid cases. So that's it for today, and maybe you have any questions or comments, or maybe tell me something I don't know about Estonia. There's a lot of that.
So thank you, Agita. Yeah. Time for questions, discussions, answers. Please, one moment. I'll give you a mic.
There's one gentleman there and another here.
I wanted to say that I can answer one of your questions when you were talking about the euthanasia thing. Then in Estonia, it's so similar, like a sister country. Like we had also this one person, one lady, who was raising money to go to Switzerland to get it done. And also we had this one of the weakest parties that's not even represented in the parliament. They did the same thing. They gathered signatures to take the euthanasia to parliament, but also the parliamentary, some group didn't take it into consideration at the moment because it was built very weakly. This was not very well educated people in this party, and they relied on some of the newspaper articles only and some Wikipedia articles. But also, I think that shows something that people gave the signatures. Mm-hmm. It's kind of important to people, and it will come again, I've heard. And some interest groups are working on new proposals and like some new laws and regulations. And I believe in a couple of years it will be back in the parliament in some way.
If not earlier, if there is a case to discuss. I mean, in Latvia, our politics is so reactive in many ways, rather than bringing up issues. There was a gentleman here.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentations. I could see a lot of commonalities between the Latvian traditions and one of the traditions that I'm studying. My question actually is that are there any rituals that are performed in order to ease the process of dying? Because when a person is in a state of agony, like the others are thinking that he should now pass on, but it feels that he or she is holding on to something. are there any sort of like specific cultural or traditions, rituals that are performed? Because one of the traditions that I'm studying, they perform oral charms in order to ease the process of dying.
Mm-hmm. Well, there is, again, we have trouble with sources. There are some records that would mention songs sung at the presence of this ill person in order to kind of ease this process of dying. Also, in Schmidt's collection of folk belief, there are some recorded items, some records, either of doing something practically, for example, and there are quite a bunch of them, of putting a person on the ground. And it's believed that when you put your, putting hay or whatever there, and then if a person is on the ground, it's easier for him or her to die rather than keep them in the bed.
It's a safe story.
Yeah, yeah. I imagine so. This is one thing, and and then there are some records, but they are again not very convincing about. I don't remember actually the year when that was recorded, but the idea is that when it looks at there's just physical signs that the person could die, then usually singers would be invited, and they would sing certain songs, and then during that moment the person dies, and then they continue on singing, because again that's part two, to ease that path. And there's quite a lot of materials about how to ease the path in the other world after kind of the threshold, if there is a threshold. And of course the wake is one of the events we can discuss. And also there is lots of beliefs about kind of the ethical aspect that, for example, evil people, may have difficulty dying, and the nicer people would suffer less, and they have easier deaths, less painless deaths. Yeah, that sort of thing. But not like a very elaborate ritual. Don't have any elaborate rituals to mention. At least I don't know of any.
So may I ask you about the ethnic component in this study? Mm-hmm. You asked only ethnic Latvians, or?
No, we asked that was nationally representative. So we do have, in fact, some conclusions because of that. For example, suicide is a Latvian thing. There was a question about have you encountered suicide in your kind of surroundings? And it was very predominantly Latvians who said yes, and the Russian speakers would be a much smaller number. So we do have some ethnic solutions, but yeah, we had also we in fact had also the survey translated, and that was that. And one thing is that actually Russian speakers are very hard to access. If somebody from the polling firm would come to your home, they would ask, are there any young men here? And that's because young men are a group that's different to access. And now they probably have to ask, are there any Russians there? Because, and it has always been so. But that was after our study. But after invasion, Ukraine has dropped dramatically. At least my friends working in sociology would say, it's very difficult to get a Russian to fill in the questionnaire currently. So maybe we didn't access that many as we would like to. But yes, we had.
So anyway, in the survey, the Russian Orthodox, they are not necessarily Russians.
They are not necessarily Russian, but majority of them are. And that would include also old believers. Old believers account for about 2% of population, but so we kind of, put them in there. Professor Valks had a question.
Yeah, thank you. It was very comprehensive. It might be difficult to say something about what you didn't ask, but I wonder, do you have an idea? Can you assess about the belief in reincarnation? How many people in Latvia today think about rebirth and reincarnation? Is it spreading in the new spirituality context?
Yeah, I can even give you a precise number, which I forgot, but it was something in the 30s, 30+%. About 1/4 of Christians believe in reincarnation. That we know from other surveys, but in our case, I tell you, and again, Lutherans, of course, are more open to the idea than Catholics and Orthodox, but not only. I tell you, I had it somewhere here. I didn't include this in my. Just a moment. Where was reincarnation? I think there was 30+ altogether, and there were differences between denominations. Where was it? Well, I'm searching. You can think of other questions. Yeah. Everybody's very quiet. I wonder, are you contemplating? 36.3% Lutherans would believe in reincarnation, and there's more neutral opinion among Orthodox and Catholics. Like less would believe, but yeah, something 1/3 maybe of it. But if you look only of Christians altogether, it was about 24, 25, that sort of thing. Again, the question is, of course, what do we understand by reincarnation? We use the if you can avoid religious kind of specific terms, you better do on surveys, because then you need a lecture to explain what that is. So we asked, are you open to the idea that a person could be reborn into this life several times? And that is as close as it gets to reincarnation. Of course, the Hindu and Buddhists would have very different understanding of that. And also, we do not know whether our respondents would think that reincarnation is a good or bad thing. Most likely good, of course, quite in contrast with what Buddhists think, but they probably see it as in qualitative part of our study, we had this, that some of the informants would say, that they hope to have another chance, so to speak. But of course, it's not representative. Yeah.
May I ask one more thing? Did you get something about near-death experiences?
No.
You didn't ask, and nobody told some experience stories or something? Nothing?
No, we didn't ask in the survey because we had rather limited money for that. They are so expensive these days. None of the there's I think there were a couple of mentions, but usually it is friend of a friend kind of thing. I heard about this person who got struck by lightning and then fall into this state, and then got back and as a completely different different person. And I believe there was one of the informants who said that she had near-death experience, and then she started to see all kinds of visions. But we did not specifically research it. So yeah, there's little mentions.
So more questions?
It's been an hour and a half nearly.
Well, so seemingly no more questions. So thank you very much again.
Thank you for having me.